Kia ora, welcome everybody. Chris, would you like to start?
Nā kātira, kia ora no tātou, tuatahi e mihi, tēnei kia ki te Kingitanga, ka mihi atu ki a koutou I tēnei wā, ki tō tātou nei kaihanga o te kingi tūheitia, ka mihi atu ki a koe, e te rangatira me te rōpū o Waikato tainui, ka mihi atu ki a koutou, tēnā hoki koutou.
Kia ora tātou. Kia ora tātou e tautoko ana ngā mihi kumihia, nō reira tīknā koe e Chris, nei tuku te roa ngā mihi ki te Kingitanga, tēnei kōrero I ahu mai I te Mata Punenga o Te Kotahi, nō reira tēnā koutou katoa. Look, just introductions to everyone here for this pre-recorded session on IP and Te Ao Māori that's been hosted by the Te Kotahi Research Institute. We're honoured to be a part of the Kingitanga Day and the reference of or the legacy of the name which we carry, Te Kotahi, which comes from Robert Te Kotahi Mahuta and the connection to Waikato Tainui. So we acknowledge him as the mana whenua for tēnei rohe, and really looking forward to this session today. So kia ora koutou. Natalie.
Kia ora, nā mahi kia koutou katoa I mātakitaki mai nei. Ko Natalie Kusabs tuko ingoa. I'm part of the rōpū whakahaere at Te Mata Punenga o Te Kotahi. Welcome to this hui on intellectual property and Te Ao Māori. Today we're going to bring you a summary of some of the work that's going on across the motu in this area, both, well, locally and internationally. Our guests are going to share some snapshots of their experiences, about 15 minutes each, and then we will follow that with an open conversation on iwi interactions with the processes around IP and what everybody has learnt so far. Shall we start with a whakawhanaungatanga? Really brief, everyone. Chris, would you like to start?
Ka te kia ora tātou, tuatahi no te whānau apa nui, tuatahi huri no ki Ngāti porau, huri no ki tēnei tā ki te whakatohea. I'm wearing two hats tonight to talk about this topic. One in my the hat of chairing Te Taumata that leads a lot of the thinking and discussion on Māori interest feeding into the free trade agreements, and also I chair the Arawa Fisheries Group, actively looking at a range of different developments, and IP is certainly right up there among our thinking.
Kia ora, thanks Chris. Penny.
Kia ora koutou. I'm Penny Gibson. I'm based in Bordeaux in France. I moved here following several years in New Zealand where I worked with Chris on various big thinking projects for Maori and IP. My involvement is very much of a practical commercial nature, which runs concurrently with the debate on IP and Maori interests, and in fact Indigenous peoples' interests, and the juxtaposition of traditional values with the IP system.
Kia ora, thanks for joining us, Penny. Then Manu.
Tēnā tātou, ai tautoko ngā mihi ki tō tātou Kingitanga. Ko ai au, he uri o Ngāti Haua, Ngāti Pukenga, ka noho au raro te maunga Hikurangi, and living on my wife's whenua and just south of Ruatoria, been involved on the coast here for 5 or 6 years with the research and development of products made from indigenous organisms and commercializing some of those, taking some through clinical research and so forth. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Manu. Tracey, nice to have you join us.
Kia ora koutou. Ko Tracey Whare, tōku ingoa, he uri tēnei no Raukawa me te whānau apanui. I'm a lecturer of law at the Auckland Law School, University of Auckland, and I teach and research into Indigenous people's rights, te tiriti o Waitangi issues, and particularly on this presentation seminar, I've been working with Manu and his people on some intellectual property issues relating to Indigenous people's rights, and the use of Taonga species in their commercialization. Kia ora.
Thank you. Maui.
Kia ora koutou, ko Maui Hudson tuku ingoa, no te whakatohia, no ngā ruahine me Ngāpuhi. I'm the director of the Te Kotahi Research Institute at the University of Waikato. My involvement in this space has largely come about through activities associated with Indigenous data sovereignty and Māori data sovereignty, thinking about how Indigenous people get control around Indigenous data. And IP is one of the mechanisms around by which that happens, as well as supporting Māori participation in research and development and the innovation space, which also requires us to get involved with issues around intellectual property. So kia ora.
Kia ora. Rogena, would you like to go next?
Kia ora katoa. Ko Rogena Sterling tuku ingoa. I'm the research officer at Te Kotahi Research Institute. I work alongside Maui and Katie Lee. I've got a law and human rights background. And excuse my cat.
And the cat.
And over the last few years, I've been working in the background of Māori rights and interests in data, and the care principles and how we can improve and enhance Indigenous rights and interests around the world, for especially in connection with data. And and currently working in the space also of cultural and intellectual property.
Thanks, Rogena. And friend, Katie Lee.
Kia ora koutou, ko Katie Lee Riddle tuku ingoa, ko runga whakata tuku iwi. I am a research assistant at Te Kotahi Research Institute, particularly working with Rogena and Maui. I am a recent graduate of Te Punenga Law Faculty at Waikato Uni, and for the past year and a half have been working alongside my colleagues here in the space of cultural and intellectual property.
Kia ora koutou. So to get started, can I ask Chris and Penny to share some of their work on smart aquaculture around Tauranga Moana? That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, ka pai. So Penny and I are going to tag team on this. I'm really just going to maybe set the scene because I don't want to steal Penny's thunder on a lot of the important stuff. But I guess my opening comments are like this, and they're more commercial than legal. And that is that if you look at what's going on around us in the world is changing fast, not just because of COVID. Things are happening really, really quickly in terms of what people are doing, what people are buying, being influenced a lot by things like climate change. And one of the things that I'm very, very clear about as a Māori person leading Māori development with different businesses, if we want our businesses to succeed, especially over the medium to longer term, we've got to be tuned into what's going on in the rest of the world. And one of the things that I'm very clear about is that the things that we will sell to the consumers of the future won't be the same things that we are selling today, like fish and like other sort of land-based type products. They will be derivatives. They will be derived from those things. And so therefore that takes us into the space of intangible assets or intellectual property. So I've long held a view that we've got to have a really good sense for what's going on in the intellectual property space. And we've seen for too long that we haven't been active in that space as well as probably what we should have for a whole bunch of reasons too, I might add. And so therefore, a lot of the work that I've certainly been involved in is thinking strategically around how do we start to carve out a space in the intellectual property space. If we look to the government to do it, I think we're going to be waiting for a long time. I mean decades, because it's been taken decades and we still don't have really robust domestic policy around IP. So really what it's done for me is to start thinking beyond relying and looking to government for leadership in the space and looking for the possible instruments that might be available by almost stepping over government and looking internationally. And what are the instruments out there that we could and should be starting to flex to secure our position as Māori people and secure our rights around intellectual property, and with a view that someday the government might catch up with what we're doing. And so really that's what's led us in the Bay of Plenty as iwi working collectively together. This is all of our iwi. We have a piece of work underway right now on, and we're actively raising around $200 million of capital to do some really collective Māori owned and led aquaculture. So we spent a year and a half thinking about what that might look like, researching the world as to what's going on in the fisheries space, what's going on in the aquaculture space, and boiling that down to what it actually might mean for us practically as iwi in the Bay of Plenty. Now, within that, what we've done is, and again, it's breaking the mold on how you think about intellectual property, and not waiting until you've done all the science and you go, aha, the light bulb goes on and you think, I've found something that I need to go and pay the $20,000 to the patent lawyer to actually register that trademark, is getting some really, really smart thinkers like who you'll meet very soon, Dr. Penelope Gibson in France, to actually help us get on the front foot and maybe start to carve out a direction of travel and secure some space for ourselves as collective iwi on IP. So this is reserving space ahead of actually creating the IP. So look, I'm going to maybe just pause it there because I think Penny will start to share with you a lot of the detail on how we're actually doing that. Penny, if you're okay, I'm going to hand over to you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Chris. That was excellent summary. So the objective was to see what instruments we could use and how we could use them flexibly internationally to fast track Bay of Plenty iwi to a world-class agriculture industry. And there were questions of novelty. Well, we were aware that there is a current debate, so we were saying, right, well, let's just use the instruments available in the interim, and how can we use those to set up and reserve future options, but certainly to make a statement about what is already owned. And so we took the view, well, intellectual property is about control. It's not necessarily about exploitation. The fundamental premise is novelty. So we looked at all the patenting trends around the world in aquaculture. Where is this going? Where is the niche for the value add? How do we secure derivatives? Let's do due diligence to really understand in advance where that value add is and what combination of intellectual property rights, leveraging foreign filings as well as New Zealand filings to make a statement that this is smart IP to support and launch this industry. And as a key part of the mission is to upskill iwi in IP, because IP is not, it's a very pragmatic business tool. We didn't want to leave it in the sort of the stratosphere of intellectual strangeness, although there's a vast consideration. It is a complex area of law. Science marries with the law in interpretation, application, even drafting, for example, patent applications. We just took a very practical view to try to overcome that and said, right, let's upskill iwi as well so that they completely understand. And it was the iwi values that really gave license to what we proposed as a new model, where there's collective ownership, which accommodates derivatives and the value add to support private enterprise. So it's not a monopoly of ownership which might obstruct commercial advances, making money, most importantly securing jobs, creating an export business that's not or that is quite immune to things like pandemic. Let's see how we can leverage IP in its broader sense. So we're licensing, how do we split up licensing, what does it mean? What are the options? So a key part of this smarter strategy was to know in advance the do's and don'ts, to be aware of the current debate in New Zealand, to ascertain novelty, but also to be cognizant of traditional knowledge, which we also took to mean a dynamic knowledge base that can enhance and progress current business activity. So it wasn't something that's hallowed. We also took into consideration the amount of disclosure that's already happened in New Zealand that impacts the novelty of what Bay of Plenty iwi aquaculture industries might be able to claim in terms of IP. And that was one of the most interesting, and I think one of the most fundamental challenges for Indigenous people moving forward. So just to cut to the chase, we looked at one particular case study for green shell mussels as a product, and working through on an exemplary basis. And this case study actually threw up and illustrated a lot of the processes and considerations. And I think, am I out of time? My screen's changed.
Can you put up the mussel one, Maui? Or who's controlling the screen?
Maui's he's put up your PowerPoint.
Oh, okay.
Well, the PowerPoint is really just in case anyone's interested afterwards. But yeah, this slide. So we looked at, for example, trademarks. We looked at, or as a future potential, there's a collective mark. There are qualitative indicators such as certification marks. Collective and certification, we were saying, right, let's harness the European system, let's harness the foreign systems to prevent imitation elsewhere, because in the past, lots of Maori indicative marks have been protected adequately in New Zealand, but we were looking abroad. It's abroad where we want to stop infringement and misappropriation. We also looked, as part of the process, we looked at rights, because ownership, a clear path to ownership is imperative for the commercialization of intellectual property. So there's discussion about supply, novelty, dependency, terms of agreement, how much you hang exclusivity on a potentially unreliable or limiting chain of supply. We looked at potential for derivatives improvements, ownership of that in terms of patents or processes. We looked at trade secrets, confidential information. So this and it's ongoing, we're in process, but this is a lovely case study that threw up all of these aspects, as well as how much is inherently Maori, how much is traditional knowledge, how much do we depend, how do we differentiate from sourcing from the land and ownership, etc. So these are just some notes on this slide to illustrate those considerations.
If I can just add for the wider audience, this is a new product. It's branded as Māori. It'll be launched across New Zealand probably within the next month. And then within the next 2 or so months, it'll get launched across Australia. By the end of the year, we'll launch it across the US, Canada, and probably into the UK by the end of the year. So,
and that's a really important point. In terms of, for example, the trademark, we will take an international trademark using the Madrid Protocol. We will protect in target export markets, and part of the SMART strategy was, as I said, that appraisal of patenting activity, importer, exporter profiles, a financial take on potential competitors and or potential licensees. So we're preparing a bundle of rights that Bay of Plenty iwi can leverage without the overheads, without, I think Chris touched on the problem of food miles and its negative effect on importation from New Zealand. So we're using IP to compensate for those types of potential barriers. And Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anything else you wanted to add, Chris?
No, I think there's a lot there. I think there's plenty for everyone to digest and ask questions about. Why don't we just leave it there?
Thank you. Hey, look, really sorry this isn't in person, because I'm sure there'd be plenty of people who would be hoping for free samples of your new products. However, we Penny has kindly offered to share some of that material. So if anyone wants to get hold of that PowerPoint, they can get in touch with us after this, and Penny will share some of her findings. Hey, right, we're going to move on now to Tracey and Manu, who are going to talk about some of their work with that they've been involved in regarding some guidelines that they've written about Taonga species and intellectual property. Looking forward to hearing about that. Tracey and Manu.
I'll start, and Tracey can do most of the important talking. I can provide a bit of background context, and yeah, Tracey's definitely the technical expert to provide some detail on where we've got to. And the projects we'll talk about are mostly still in play and not fully in the public domain yet, so there'll be some stuff that we'd love to share that we probably just can't at the moment, but there is some stuff that is in the public domain that we love to share and is available. But we sort of started about 5 or 6 years ago. Our whānau moved home to Rōtoria, and had been working with been involved with the local hapu and looking at economic opportunities for the community. Myself and another local brought in some smart scientists from outside the region. We were looking at sort of what are alternatives to forestry and dry stock sheep and beef farming, which are the main industries on the coast, sort of high volume, low value commodities. How can we create higher value products and assets that are owned by the locals? And so these researchers looked at the resources that are available in the community, and we've got a lot of kānuka growing around the coast. The Mānuka honey boom was in full swing. We decided to stay away from that, and glad we did. But looked at kānuka, and particularly the oil extracted from the leaves. Also looked at other things, kawakawa, kina, and a bunch of other plants and organisms. But kānuka and kina actually were the ones that sort of took off, and we found that there was some very basic research on kānuka oil that suggested it may have some unique and interesting properties. So we pursued that, and with it 3 Māori land blocks, we took some samples and put it through a number of tests in the lab, and proved that it had some interesting properties, proved to ourselves. From there, started to produce some more oil. We set up a little extraction facility, and were collecting kānuka from a number of land blocks. Pretty quickly, we were, sort of the land blocks were keen to contribute, but wanted to understand sort of where it was heading, which was important, and we wanted to get some clarity around that for everybody involved. We'd also started talking to not only research partners, but commercial partners as well, who were interested in one company that's heavily involved in kānuka honey. We're interested in expanding into kānuka oil products, so we have developed some JV with them. And the kina was partnering with hapu around the coast who have mana moana over their customary area of the coast, and were interested in collaborating where we'd pay for the research and they'd contribute some kina, and we'd look at the bioactive extracts that are found in kina, particularly the shell, and we promised to leave the roe alone. And there were some interesting results from that. Again, both those projects are ongoing, and Tracey will talk a bit about the process that we used in the relationship building and the legal agreements with those mana whenua, mana moana entities, but also the wider sort of questions around the species themselves and what rights and and ownership they might have in IP that was being developed. In things like, do atua have opportunity to share an ownership of IP, and how would you sort of work out legal arrangements around that? And there's another plant that I'm involved with that's a Taonga species. It's endemic to Aotearoa and has quite a lot of international interest. And there's this real tension between the imperative to do things right in terms of Te Tiriti and Y262 and Nagoya and all of those obligations that are rightly in place or coming into force, and the commercial imperative where we've got overseas competitors who have taken samples of things and don't have the same ethical or legal constraints on them, and we're in a race really to develop products or technologies or IP that could be protected with those who don't have some of the same constraints as we put on ourselves or that we feel obligated to adhere to. So that was, that's been an interesting one, and that's had some patents, and the molecules have been synthesized and things, and these are found in species endemic to Aotearoa. And the fourth project I'll just quickly touch on is cannabis. So after was alongside the native plants and organisms, we started working on cannabis, and in that one we've been thinking about how do these principles of kaitiakitanga apply to cannabis, which isn't indigenous to Aotearoa, but we want to be consistent with our ethics and make sure that there's benefit share and opportunity for those communities of origin that cannabis comes from to participate in what's a sort of massive global industry already in some of the poorest parts of the world, through Asia, Central Asia, and in the Middle East, and even in Afghanistan in the last month. How do we if we are attributing benefit back to those communities that have supplied seed or genetics, how do we actually get the benefit into those places, which is some quite dodgy situations now. So tried to, so I've been involved in a medicinal cannabis company, and we're thinking through in terms of breeding, PVRs, plant variety rights, and opportunities to build those rights in sharing in the benefit to those communities of origin. So trying to be consistent across all of those things, and it's been an interesting journey, but we definitely have lent heavily on people like Tracey to help us in those processes. And just hand over to you, Tracey, to talk about how we've gone through some of that.
Right, thank you, Manu. So even though Manu's talked about a number of projects, I'll just make it clear that I've only been involved in the kānuka and the kina one. Once they had already established relationships with landowners in Hapu and had entered into agreements for the collection of those species from their coastal areas and from their lands to undertake the research component. But that included in those agreements a clause which said intellectual property issues need to be addressed, and we want to do that, but not within this agreement. So I was approached to start to think about how we might approach intellectual property and these big questions around the ownership of the Taonga species, or at least the ownership of the new research component. And then the big question around, if there is to be some commercial gain, how might that be shared, or how might the benefit be distributed? So those were the kinds of questions that I was first approached about. But also, I think with Manu and his team, they were thinking not just beyond the specific commercial arrangement, because they could have gone to any commercial lawyer and simply asked them to draft some kind of agreement, but they also wanted to consider things like what does kaitiakitanga mean in this context? What, if any, obligations arise in relation to Te Tiriti o Waitangi and concepts such as tino rangatiratanga and kāwanatanga and Taonga itself, and also what's happening in international law in relation to Indigenous people's rights that may also have an impact or help us answer some of these questions. And one of the big things that also came up as we kind of journeyed along was the impact of colonisation and the huge issue of economic injustice, and the fact that it was not the local people who were the ones who had decided to undertake these new initiatives, but it was an entity that was included some Māori locals, but also non-Māori people who were starting this process and wanting to ensure a good relationship with the local people, but also in some way wanting to address that huge imbalance between what they were trying to do and the fact that the local people themselves were not in a position to do it themselves. So we really wanted to address all these big substantive questions, as well as address some of the more commercial aspects of what this might look like if it ever became something that was commercially viable. And my perspective was to talk about or start to conceptualise these questions from a tikanga perspective and from a rights perspective. And so we delved quite deeply into tikanga Māori and tried to grapple with things like who owns kānuka, maybe ngā atua own kānuka, so Tāne Mahuta owns kānuka, and what does that mean for how we might use this resource? Or perhaps kānuka owns kānuka, and all of the things that derive from kānuka are owned by kānuka, and what would that mean for the relationship between the Māori communities and the kānuka species? So we had some really deep discussions around these quite conceptual ideas, and where we arrived at around this particular issue was to say that in line with developments in Indigenous people's rights, where ownership and control of intellectual property is affirmed or recognised in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the place where we landed, which included both a lot of pragmatic elements, was to say that it was the landowners who would own that intellectual property that came out of that research process, and they in turn would have a license back to the commercial entity, which would allow them to use that research and to delve into whether it was commercially viable. So that's the arrangement that we came to. That took a long period of time, so we used tikanga as well in our processes. So all of the hui were conducted within in community, at marae, people's homes. I was asked to facilitate that kind of discussion, so I wrote a number of discussion papers that helped to frame the issues and allow people to delve deeply into some of the things that we were discussing. And it also allowed, obviously, trust to be built. A huge component of that, just ensuring that people we went on the journey together. As a kind of an outsider, as a researcher, I had no set agenda as to what was the outcome to be, and for myself I was learning just as much as the community as to what these things meant in practice for them on the ground. So that was really important, and we did come to an agreement in that what we arrived at was to use components of state law, but ultimately the way it's been conceptualised and the way that the final agreement was written very much reflects tikanga Māori and the way that the communities and the commercial entities see each other and want to work together. And so we did, I think, quite successfully address some of these big substantive issues, particularly around economic injustice. So there's this, the agreement provides that over time, if the commercial enterprise gets underway and it's successful, that there's a governance board established whereby local Māori are involved, and that gives them an opportunity to upskill and become totally cognizant of all of the workings of that commercial activity, and eventually into the future at some point that license will be revoked, and that the local people, in establishing a collective of their own, will take over the enterprise itself. So it puts them in a position where they have upskilled themselves into this space with support, plenty of support, and then they are in a position to take over the entity themselves, and Manu and his people will retire from that particular activity. So I think that's been really a big selling point for everybody, is to find a way forward that really honours or that addresses that big issue, that it's provided an opportunity to practice tino rangatiratanga, that the communities have very much driven this by the kinds of questions they have, the concerns and issues that they've raised, and their need to ensure that this is a process and a project that restores their relationships with that Taonga species and with each other, because there's often lots of tensions within communities about here's a new idea and what does it mean and we might miss out and all those kinds of things. So I think that we tried very hard to ensure that we brought the people along, that they were the ones leading the project, and that we were very accommodating and finding creative ways to address their concerns. So from a researcher's perspective, I found it very exciting. It's very invigorating to kind of be part of that redevelopment or that use of tikanga Māori in a very contemporary setting. And as Manu has said, this is still a work in progress. There's been lots of people that have contributed to that agreement. Other lawyers, we've ensured that people have had independent legal advice. So there's been lots of kind of input. So if you read the document, it's all a bit wordy and a bit all over the place, as consensual consensus making documents often can be, but it has that ownership of not only the people that drafted it, but the people who will benefit and who were active participants in its creation. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Kia ora kōrua. Fascinating stuff. Love hearing about the succession planning that's gone into this informed consultation. It sounds brilliant. Well, we'll have some more discussion about that, I'm sure, after this, but we may now kick off with the team from Te Kotahi, who are going to talk about their recent report on understanding Māori rights and interests in intellectual property arising from research and innovation. So now I know what you've been doing in the office. Kia ora. Maui, do you want to get started? Are you there?
Sorry. I'll continue the theme of providing an overview and a context and allow the wahine tour to say, actually, here's the ngako o te mahi. We've also got some slides, so a little bit of a departure, so for this second bit, but I'll just make sure I can do this. What I'm doing, sharing screen. Kia ora. Here we go. And I mean, this ends up being a really interesting situation. You know, when you're working in a research institute, both when you're working in a research institute and actually when you're also working with an iwi organisation. I'm on the Whakatoi Māori Trust Board. All those muscles which Chris was showing, they come from our farm. So, you know, we've got interest in the things that are happening there too. But anything you're involved in around thinking about trying to advance things commercially for your people, you start to bump into these issues around intellectual property, or actually it's more about how do you protect the interests? And then that kind of steers you towards, you know, in what ways can you use intellectual property to support that? And so, you know, looking at this, and it arises in a variety of different ways. And even this picture here, this is the mural, which is now on the side of the Whakatoi Māori Trust Board, which has just been done by Graham Hoite. So, you know, we're having to acknowledge him as the artist. He was using our kind of traditional knowledge as the inspiration for his new artwork. And, you know, where do those things sit in the context of, you know, these sorts of things about ownership or rights to use in different ways? And it's also kind of popped up, you know, both of the presentations have been great. So, you know, mihi kia koutou for sharing those. And, you know, they're focused on its role in the context of Taonga species, but we're also thinking about, as we talk about traditional knowledge, how it plays out in other spaces. So as our iwi have put together a waiata app and started to make available our waiata in a kind of in a broader context, what happens around the sorts of ideas around ownership and protection of that. And alongside, there's some other work which we're doing, just about to release these guidelines around genomic research on Taonga species. So exactly the sort of thing which, Tracey and Manu are doing, the sorts of things which Chris are involved in. But we're really doing that and speaking to the scientists and the people that are sort of upstream of this conversation. So they're often doing it just for the research purpose, but it generates information, it generates data, it generates knowledge that might find its way into a commercial space. And so how do we make sure that, Māori interests are maintained along that whole pathway? And in some ways, I just think about, the wairua element of it, all these sort of two streams where we're both trying to provide some protection, but also trying to engage in innovation. And some of the tensions that arise around doing that and how they can be managed together become really interesting. And so, the pictures here talking about Y262, and it's already been referenced. And so, long history of thinking and claims and assertions about our cultural intellectual property rights in relation to Indigenous flora and fauna, in relation to our traditional knowledge. And then with the Chris's Smart Aquaculture program, he talked about, some of the work they'd done around Māori interest in geographical indicators, which was some of the precursor work to the things that they shared with us today. So, in some ways, this has just been a part of the context. And so what we wanted to do was have a look and see how are universities and how are Crown Research Institutes, because they're often the drivers of a lot of this research activity, what are they doing in terms of the policies they put in place to protect Māori interests? And how are those sorts of conversations being facilitated? So that's the work that Katie Lee and Rogena had been involved in. And I'm going to just pass it on to them to talk a little bit more about the sort of the actual work that we did.
Kia ora, Māori. So the first part of this project, we really wanted to capture a clear image of what the IP landscape in New Zealand really does look like. And so there's three levels to that. There's the legislation, and then there's the international covenants that we are both part of and not part of, and then also the non-legal options that we can look at. So first of all, we went into what legislation is out there for IP, what is currently available for Māori, and we explore that on the next slide. But aside from that, which international conventions can we really look to see where can we get our protection from, where can we be working towards, and what are the standards that are set internationally? So that's where we started looking at UNDRIP and the Nagoya Protocol, and from there we went into, okay, so what non-legal options and protections are really out there? So what are the rights and interests in my Taonga Māori? What is Indigenous data sovereignty? How does that look like in New Zealand? What is OCAP? What is really Indigenous data governance? And how can we use both an ethical standpoint and the care principles and these non-legal options such as traditional knowledge labels and biocultural labels? And how can we use that to start to protect our Taonga Māori and our IP rights? So on the next slide, we see the current IP framework and Māori provisions in the legislation. And as you can see on the left, you'll see a list of the legislation that we currently have in place, what they're for, and in the third column, what protection and provision is there for Māori. And a common theme that you'll see along this legislation is that there is either no provision at all, or there is a Māori advisory committee that has been established. And these committees have a merely advisory function. They can make recommendations, but they don't have any binding power. So then what recommendations can we make for the future? Of course, there's finally incorporating Y262 into our legislature, but how can we look at giving these Māori advisory committees more binding power and really broaden that mandate and give them the mana that they need to have to be able to assist in making these decisions? So from the legislature, we wanted to then look, okay, as Maui has said, how are the research institutions across New Zealand operating within that IP framework and what protections are there for Māori currently. So we sent a survey discussing all of these various topics to 57 different institutions and received 17 responses, of which some were particularly in depth, some were simply yes or no and quite brief. But we found that of those 17 responses, we had 14 institutions that said, yes, we do have an IP policy. From there, however, we found that not many have specific provision for Taonga Māori, genomic data for Taonga species, and commercialization. However, some of these institutions have acknowledged that, yes, they have worked with Taonga Māori and traditional knowledge in the past. So we found from that survey that even though some institutions are engaging with Māori, some institutions also just don't simply have the tools or the knowledge yet to know how can they work in that space, how can they be good treaty partners, and what can we do better. So we found that there are two things we can do, which the first being to increase capacity. So how can we help these institutions to gain the knowledge and the tools they need to make these changes? And secondly, what recommendations can we give and how can we help to give those tools back? So the challenges in that are recognizing when there is an interest, how can we tell that there is an interest that needs to be, given to Māori, and recognition that needs to be given to Māori, and identifying what those differences are and how we engage in that space, and how do we give institutions the tools to engage in that space. I will pass on to Rogena to continue on. Thank you.
Kia ora. So as part of this, we're looking at genomic data in Taonga species. So in discussing that, we'll come back to the Y262 report that we've talked about earlier. And the tribunal there made it very clear that Māori have a connection, a relationship with Taonga species. So that was highly emphasised in the report. And iwi, hapu, whānau have this kaitiaki responsibility through their whakapapa. And this has been mentioned in some of the earlier discussions with some of the other groups as well. So this the whakapapa relationship that goes right back up to that spiritual connection as well, and comes through into the Taonga species as well. And so these connect through things like whanaungatanga with these species. As mentioned, we talked about the kaitiaki-tanga responsibilities, but also having the tohunga, that's special knowledge, the people within the local rohe having that special knowledge in regards to these different Taonga species, and how these species react with the people, the environment, and exist within. So within that kaitiaki responsibilities, all these different elements were there to be held together. But what was also made clear in this report was, under the current legislation, sometimes there's no particular proprietary rights in the Taonga species that were enabled through this legislation. So it was made clear there was a cultural relationship, but was there an enabled rights or proprietary relationship? And that was something of issue. So even under the current laws, some of them, for example, the Plant Varieties Act, the Patents Act, Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Act, which relate to Taonga species. At most, they may have Māori advisory committees, but they don't have specific protections of Taonga species themselves. We also know, which has also been mentioned, New Zealand is bound by various international laws and treaties that we've signed into. For example, the Convention on Biological Diversity. And these also need to be taken into account because they also restrict certain rights and interests within New Zealand.
So it looks like the cat is muted you, Rogena. I think you're going to talk about the genetic, that transition from the interest in Taonga species and what it means for the generation of genetic data.
Yeah. So Taonga species are not an invention themselves, not a product in themselves, but of course, as other groups have talked about, there can be derivatives that come from some of these Taonga species. So when New Zealand works with these international obligations, we need to make sure that, that these kaitiaki responsibilities and relationships that Māori have with the Taonga species are protected within any new international treaties that we connect to. So genetic data, often it's been traditionally shared openly. So it's like almost like a general expectation amongst science that such data is left open so that everyone has access to it. And that data, as we know, is often getting very valuable now in the data age. So the question then becomes, if it's left open, who is caring for it, who's having responsibility for it, and where is that value being able to be drawn back, which is an important point, especially something that's covered within the Nagoya Protocol, which unfortunately New Zealand's not signed up to yet, but hopefully we can push the government towards it at some stage. And within that protocol is important because it talks about gaining the benefit sharing from to enable iwi, hapu, and whānau to have benefit from the Taonga species and any data that's derived from that. But at the present, there's limited protections within the current regimes. And next slide. So one thing that has kind of come up through our research is we've got this complex web of, we've got some of these legal rights, but sometimes we may, iwi or hapu may not have the right, but they have a strong interest in a particular issue. And this contrasts with, are those rights or interests exclusive versus are they shared with a collective or community? Are they towards an individual or are they towards a collective? And discussing any of these issues to do with intellectual property, cultural intellectual property, it's a balance between looking at how are these different rights and interests within this whole web at one particular point in time. So, yeah.
Kia ora. And look, and just following on from that, I think realize, and you would have seen from the discussions, is that these tensions that arise, and in some ways there are areas where intellectual property rights can be applied, and this is our iceberg in some, our sort of iceberg drawing in some regards, where the places where intellectual property rights can be applied is only a small part of the things which we would like to assert some control over. And so that sort of pushes us, at least in terms of the way we're thinking about it, to be able to use intellectual property rights in the places where it can be used, but start thinking about other extra legal mechanisms or other ways in which that information or data or knowledge can be controlled. And some of those things sit in more of a, down towards a trade secret space, but also in the creation of repositories and being able to hold information in your own database as a trade secret becomes a way which you can protect it by adding things like labels to it, so it becomes really clear and transparent to other users of that information that it's something that belongs to you. And when people know that it sort of belongs to you, then as they think about using it in other ways, they have a responsibility to come and engage with you around that. So in lots of ways, we've found when we've been doing work in this sort of the genetic space, that just like we can't get intellectual property over the traditional knowledge itself or over the Taonga species itself, once data is being generated, once these new sorts of products or services or resources are created from them, those are the things that then are that other people are often able to get intellectual property rights over. And I think we've had some really good examples today with both the previous case studies, where it's Māori groups that are looking how do we apply those and ensure that those intellectual property rights stay with our communities. So one of the projects we've been working with in the sort of extra legal space, and dealing with both traditional knowledge or traditional knowledge labels, but also biocultural labels for genetic resources, is thinking about how we can, or how iwi are in a position to sort of tag that information in some of the data sets in the places where it's being shared, so that if other activities or other people want to use them, they know who they should come to talk to about that. And you can give it an indication of both the sort of the provenance associated with that material, any kind of traditional protocols that are related to the sharing of that material, and give an indication around the sorts of permissions that have been approved by the community for the future use of that material. So the things that we recommended at the back end of the report was really a number of steps to improve the responsiveness of research institutions to Māori interests in intellectual property. And I think this is where, we have this, in lots of ways, this dual responsibility to do the upskilling, like Tracey and Manu talked about, and Chris and Penelope are advocating for upskilling in the community, but also making these sort of changes in the institutions which our community have to engage with. So how do we do that and ensure that they are aware about issues from tikanga Māori to Māori data sovereignty, mātauranga Māori to cultural intellectual property, and ensuring that the policies they have in place which frame the way they think about IP are responsive to the needs of Māori communities. And part of that is ensuring that there's more people operating in that space within those areas. And whole aim is that we can get more ethical practices and equitable outcomes from the research and innovation activities. So, kia ora koutou. The three of us that are on here, as well as just a mihi with those two. Robert Tūronga Brooks, who was the other team member we had on this project.
Kia ora Maui, kia ora team, Katie Lee and Rogena, that was great. Hey, we are a little pressed for time, but we have good 10, maybe 15 minutes to have a quick discussion amongst ourselves, which we should get underway. I was really fascinated by some of the stuff that Manu and Tracey were talking about with their informed consent and about how to go about informing all the parties who are involved. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. Has anyone else got questions on that?
Maybe I can just explain a bit about the parties involved. So, as I said, when we started out, we were trying to do something that could create jobs and economic opportunities in the community. The existing community structures are, we started in 2015, Ngāti Porou settled in 2012, and Hapu had been meeting before and after settlement to kind of get themselves organised around post-settlement governance arrangements, and continue to meet, and the Hapu recognised economic development as kind of the biggest and most important, and well, not the most important, but the biggest and hardest thing to work on, in addition to everything else that they've been trying to progress around education and conservation and cultural regeneration and so forth. So we saw all of that activity going on. With their support, suggested that we set up a commercial entity that would be owned by the community. So it was a charitable company that have its directors are local residents or Ngāti Porou, and its one shareholder is a charitable trust, and that charitable trust can only do charitable things in the activity in the community. The charitable company can only do commercial activities to earn money for the charitable trust, but neither entity had any money, so we needed some private investors as well. So that they were brought in. We formed a limited partnership between private investors in these in the charitable company, and that's the entity that has been the partner with the Māori land blocks and with the hapu for the kina, and is the, so it has strong in and of itself. It's 60% owned by the community anyway, but there's these other parties that are a part of that. And so those were the entities that were coming into a relationship for kānuka with 15 Māori land blocks. And then we also had to think about all of the other Māori land blocks on the East Coast that have kānuka with similar genetic characteristic, profile to the trees on the blocks that were in the project. And so the hundreds that were outside of the project, how could they be recognised in the arrangements? And Tracey and the whānau working on it came up with some creative arrangements to sort of have placeholders for that, and also for, as Tracey said, perhaps kānuka itself is also a co-owner in the IP. And as Tracey said, she was very involved in facilitating as an independent, non-Ngāti Whare person in those discussions between this commercial entity and those kaitiaki as landowners. And within the land blocks, of course, there's hundreds, thousands of landowners who weren't necessarily part of those conversations, who their representatives were, and you've got all of those dynamics that they need to deal with. So there's a whole lot of work going on amongst those land blocks themselves about how to organise themselves into something that can have a commercial relationship with something else. And then we have other partners outside of those relationships that are also involved in the R&D and taking products to market and they wanted certainty. Everybody wants a bit of certainty, as much certainty as possible in these arrangements. So our other commercial partners didn't want to be dealing with thousands of individual landowners, or even 15 Māori land blocks. They wanted one thing that could represent the interests of those things as we take something to market. If we're looking for further investment, if we're signing legal agreements with big pharmaceutical companies or whoever, we need a lot of certainty around those things, and that's where Tracey's facilitation has helped to establish some really good relationships. And as she said, based on trust that's been built over a number of years of having those hui and that kōrero that's gone on.
Can I ask a question? I'm sort of interested because both, you and having established a collective, and then as Chris and Penelope are talking too about, collective to deal with IP as well. In having that discussion about the collective, how do you put a boundary around it? Like, who's in and like, how do you get into the kōrero about who's in and who's out?
Mm.
And whether it's an opt-in or opt-out or just like everyone in and.
Yeah, and again, these are ongoing conversations, and what we've done is, Trace can correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, there's a 2-year sort of window for those, there's an agreement now that everybody's, we got to a point where there was sufficient consensus that people were happy with the agreement. Those land block representatives are taking it back to their block and saying, is this okay for us to sign up to? We think it's a good deal, but and so they've got 2 years from when the first block signs to decide whether they're in or out. And if we haven't heard from them within 2 years, we'll assume that they're not going to be part of the project going forward. But as I say, we're also trying to carve out a bit of the IP ownership that will be for those blocks that aren't in the project, but are essentially kaitiaki of the Taonga themselves. Is that right, Tracey?
Yes, and I mean, a bigger part too is obviously both kānuka and kina are not solely found on the East Coast. So we also had those bigger questions about, this is the Taonga species for all Māori, so how do we address that? We didn't quite come to a finality on that point, but within the agreement we've also included the ability because the different landowners for the kānuka are signing it as their independent entities, at some point, we've kind of flagged in the agreement that they should consider forming themselves as their own collective. so that if in the future they decide to take over the business, they're all set up and ready to go. That's another project in itself. And so the communities have some funding to start a process of looking what that might look like. And again, delving into tikanga Māori is the kind of normative framework to come to some entity that they are happy with and that can address all those concerns. But it was a huge issue as we were going forward, in that it was that kind of pragmatic approach where you've got relationships with certain landowners, they've agreed to come on board. You've got to work with the people that are keen and are motivated. You don't leave the others behind, but yet at some point you have to kind of work with those who want to work with you. So I guess the short answer is there's no final answer, but it's been something that we're very, very cognizant throughout the project, and have tried to accommodate it and be flexible about how we might approach it, but also looking into the future, how might we do it differently for other projects if the same kinds of issues were to arise.
Thanks. Chris, have you been thinking about that too? You're on mute. You're still muted.
Yeah, we have Maui been thinking about the same issues, and listening to Manu and Tracey, kind of same sorts of issues, maybe at a different scale. So the Bay of Plenty iwi kaupapa around aquaculture is started off and still is basically that all iwi were involved in the discussion. That was a hui that we had at Whakatane a year and a half ago, that we all believed that none of us could do this thing on our own. So that's been a guiding principle all the way through. That's on the basis that the door will be open to all of the iwi to participate. Like what Tracey is saying, assuming they want to participate. And another guiding principle that we've held, especially as we start to get towards the more commercial stage of the development, and that is that we'll never give up a controlling interest to non-Māori, if you like. That the iwi will always hold a controlling interest in the overall development. So, and you'll know that, you know, when you're doing this stuff, you have the normal lawyers, they come in and they develop the general partnerships and the limited partnerships, etc. What we've done here around IP is, so we've had Penny working directly alongside our commercial lawyer, a lady by the name of Justine Inns, who's done a lot of work in setting up Māori collectives, the ICP, and I see you smiling there, so you probably know Justine, and Ngai Tahu. So, you know, we've had some good minds and looking at other examples out there, but really designing in at the very earliest stages, thinking around structurally, how do we organize ourselves to preserve the intellectual property that may arise at some point into the future. Penny, did you want to talk a bit about that from your work with Justine? You might be gone.
Yeah, no, she's on mute too.
Oh, Penny.
That's the bane.
Hi, sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, oh dear, sorry. Chris is exactly right. One of the most important things was the maintenance and continuation of IP that would both protect all iwi interests, protect the industry sector, and maintain the future potential. So the idea is we came up with a management entity that would do all of that. So it would be Guardian, it would be you know, horizon scanning, it would be integral to business decisions, it would support active iwi business as well as that whole community. So it had very much a dual role, which Maui, I think you touched on as well. And one of my questions I had actually reading the page, Tracey, your paper, was how I think you mentioned that rights would revert at a certain point, and I was interested how whether you had differentiated between the forms of intellectual property right that support commercial but complement iwi-wide activity, because every form of IP is different and serves a different purpose, and some of them, they're not mutually exclusive, and some are very complementary to iwi interest, to that long-term, that spiritual relationship, and some are very commercial. And I couldn't decipher in your guide where that point, once the rights had reverted, what guarantees, or maybe it's a provision within the agreement you've drawn up, what obligations to maintain that intellectual property, to safeguard the options for landowners or in my mind suppliers moving forward.
Thank you. That's a good question. I'm just trying to, I don't have the agreement in front of me, but I do recall we put a term in there basically saying that the landowners were unable to alienate the intellectual property. So that intellectual property that had been agreed to as theirs to own, they would own it forever. So that's how we got around that. Well, that's how we addressed that issue. So, and they agreed with that, because they said if we are kaitiaki, if we are serious about our relationship with these Taonga species, in what universe would we ever, give up those rights? So that's how we address that particular issue.
And they would further the development of those rights for future generations to maintain their relevance and their validity.
Absolutely, yeah. That's how they understood their obligations as kaitiaki and as mana whenua. Yeah.
Right.
That's an interesting, takes us to an interesting point about the responsibilities and obligations that come along with being kaitiaki, as well as the value that is possible to get from IP. Hey, fascinating. Thank you, everybody. Really enjoyed this evening's and this morning's talk for you, Penelope. I'm sure people will have some questions. If they want to get hold of us, please contact myself, Maui, at rangaho@waikato.ac.nz, and we can forward questions on to all the parties involved in this Zoom call, which has been actually just such a good way to spend my evening. Hey, thank you, everybody. Ngā mihi mai aha ki a koutou katoa for coming and contributing. And hopefully everybody will really enjoy this. I'm sure I know that I did. Okay, I think that's us. Kia ora all.